Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are decoding an absolutely profound historical mystery from the first century. We're going to map out how deep-seated regional trauma and some really intense geographical bias completely blinded a group of highly educated people to the very thing they had been waiting centuries to see. Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine an entire crowd rejecting a highly anticipated world-changing figure, not because of what he said and not because of what he did, but quite simply because of his zip code. It's kind of crazy, right? But this wasn't just a casual dismissal. It was a rejection rooted in a deep geographical scar and an ancient trauma. It's a really compelling contradiction. How on earth could a simple hometown location completely disqualify someone in the eyes of the cultural elite? Section 1. The Galilean Stigma. Regional Prejudice. To really understand this dynamic, we first have to look at the immediate conflict playing out between the southern Judean elite and the north. When the Jerusalem crowd points at Jesus and says, "We know this man whence he is," we are speaking with this thick, heavy tone of localized superiority. You see, to the first century Judean elite, Galilee was far from just some scenic northern region. It was a territory carrying a profound historical stain. So the absolute crucial point here is that their outright rejection wasn't based on his actions. It was based entirely on their intense geographical bias regarding his origins. They essentially looked at him and said, "Yeah, we know exactly where you're from, and nothing good comes from there." This brings us to a massive, almost baffling question. Why did a simple northern hometown disqualify the Messiah? Why was the region of Galilee viewed with such profound contempt? Well, to answer this, we can't just look at the first century. We actually need to put on our historical detective hats and look backward, tracing the roots of this prejudice to uncover the real answer. Section 2. The Trauma of 727 BCE. Historical Scar Tissue. We need to flash back hundreds of years to understand this region's deep inherited trauma. Our inciting incident occurs way back in 727 BCE. King Hoshea, who was ruling the northern kingdom, initiates a rebellion. Shortly after, the massive Assyrian Empire responds by systematically dismantling the northern tribes. Fast forward to the first century, and we see the result. Galilee is viewed with a profound historical stain. This wasn't just a lost battle, It was an event that utterly fractured the geographical and political landscape of the North for generations. The result of this invasion was what became known as Galilee of the Gentiles. The Assyrians used this brutal tactic of forced deportations, combined with the deliberate infusion of foreign pagan populations into the region. This created an immense physical and spiritual breach. In the southern Judean mind, Galilee became a place of linguistic compromise, mixed lineages, and spiritual darkness. To them, it was literally a contaminated landscape. So, when the elite southern Judean mind looked at Jesus, all they saw was a man from Nazareth. They mapped his identity entirely by the physical coordinates of a region that had been broken and minimized since that Assyrian crisis centuries earlier. You kind of have to empathize with their conceptual block here. They were entirely unable to fathom that the ultimate glory of their restoration could spring from the very soil that had suffered their earliest and deepest devastation. To them, the map dictated the man. Section 3. The Apocalyptic Expectation, Waiting for a Mystery. Let's move to and see how this builds as we transition back to the first century. Here is the second half of the crowd's objection. But when Christ cometh, no man knoweth whence he is. Now, this reveals an incredible irony. Because the 10 northern tribes had completely vanished into obscurity during the Assyrian exile, a totally new theological expectation developed. Intertestamental literature began to theorize that the ultimate deliverance would come from a completely hidden supernatural remnant kept secret by God. They expected a Messiah completely detached from known geography. Let's contrast these two concepts for a second. On one side, we have the traumatized expectation. The crowd was waiting for a hidden supernatural remnant bursting from cosmic anonymity to forcefully reverse the visible scattering of their history. On the other side, we have the divine reality. Jesus had an ordinary public upbringing in the familiar, scarred town of Nazareth. Because he had a known address, they disqualified him. They mistakenly read his ordinary human veil as a complete absence of divine authority. They figured, well, because he wasn't a cosmic secret, he simply couldn't be the solution. Section 4. Horizontal versus vertical origins, a shift in coordinates. This brings us to the absolute climax of this explainer. Jesus directly addresses them in the temple courts. And what's really interesting about this is how he responds to their very human mapping. He cries out, "Ye both know me, and you know whence I am. And I am not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not." He doesn't deny his geographic address in Nazareth. Instead, he challenges their entire framework. Let's thoroughly unpack this, because the paradigm shift here is brilliant. Think about the dimension of origin. The crowd was operating entirely on a horizontal grid. To them, origin meant Nazareth, the geopolitically scarred north. But Jesus shifts to a vertical reality. His true origin isn't horizontal geography at all. It is the Father in heaven, the timeless source. Now consider the blindness. The crowd believed physical geography and human genealogies dictated spiritual capacity. They were basically trying to trace God using the historical wreckage of 727 BCE. Jesus points out their true blindness. They proudly knew his earthly town, for sure, but they were entirely blind to the one who sent him. Jesus literally takes their horizontal coordinate axis and flips it completely vertical. Section 5. The failure of human mapping, closing the gates. As we transition to our conclusion, we find a brilliant spiritual synthesis of everything we discussed today. In 727 BCE, King Hoshea looked to Egypt for physical alliances and political salvation, completely ignoring the prophets, which resulted in the absolute erasure of the northern kingdom. Centuries later, the descendants of that very survival story, the Judean crowd in John 7, made the exact same error. They looked to their own rigid theological traditions and geographic maps, and in doing so, they completely ignored the living word standing right in their midst. And this brilliantly illustrates the parallel. Both generations relied on human maps, and both completely missed the divine reality. The overarching lesson here is pretty clear. There is immense danger in using historical trauma, political maps, or rigid traditions to define the boundaries of how God should operate. The Jerusalem elite were looking for a spectacular, hidden cosmic king to validate their specific, trauma-induced expectations. Because they were staring so intently at their maps, they completely missed the sovereign who purposefully chose to hide his greatest glory within a humble, scarred Galilean frame. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How often do our own rigid naps close the gates of recognition? When we map out exactly how things should happen based on our own past scars, biases, or traditions, what profound realities might be standing right in front of us completely unrecognized? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating historical narrative with me. Take some time to reflect on this and keep learning.